Welcome back to our exegesis on James. This lecture, we're going to be dealing with the Bible and empire, or the empire and the Bible. And then later, more specifically, we'll talk about the Roman Empire and the letter of James. But here is the Colosseum in Rome, this kind of iconic symbol of Roman imperialism, built in the first century, not long after the life of Jesus. But today we're going to look at the Bible as maybe a piece of empire, or certainly text written during empire. The entire Bible, both the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the intertestamental period, which is when the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books were written, and the New Testament. So let's look at empire and the Bible. And you have to go all the way back to the Assyrian Empire and the book of Jonah. The book of Jonah is a real interesting piece. A lot of people talk about it's a great book of God's mercy and Jonah's unwillingness to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. But Jonah can also be a book of satire in the sense that Jonah does not want to go and bring a word of salvation to Nineveh because he knows they're their enemies, and he feels like Nineveh will repent and do what God wants, and all that'll do is allow them to continue with their empire and eventually take the northern kingdom at the time. This was during the divided period when the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Israel were two separate things, way after David. So you had the northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judah. Well, Jonah preaches what God says eventually, and sure enough, the people of Nineveh repent and God forgives them and has mercy on them. And it could be a story of how mercy might not be a good thing, because everybody knows that Sennacherib, the emperor of the Assyrian Empire, utterly destroys the northern kingdom, and that's the end of it, that it's never again heard of. So Jonah is a book deeply ingrained in empire and the issue of empire, and it's a story written from below. We'll talk about that a little bit. The Assyrians fade and the Babylonians take over, and it's during Babylonian exile. So Nebuchadnezzar came, destroyed Judah and Jerusalem, and took the ruling elite back to Babylon as exiles and left the regular people. While in captivity, while in exile in Babylon, the Babylonians had a main god called Marduk, and Marduk had a creation story of how everything came from Marduk. And the Babylonians understood the fact that they understood their destruction of Jerusalem as the fact that Marduk, their god, was greater than the other gods of the countries that they captured. And I would say Marduk is the chief god because the Babylonians were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. And so they completely understood the fact that Marduk had defeated Yahweh at a cosmic level, which is why the Babylonians were able to capture Judah and take the king and the aristocracy as prisoners back to Babylon. And so it's in Babylonian captivity and Babylonian exile that the priests began to write their own account of creation. And you get this iconic passage from Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2:4, where there is nothing except God. And in the beginning was God, and that God was the one who created everything. And not one thing that exists today didn't come from the God of Israel. And so Genesis 1 is a story to say that the God of Israel is the only God, and and the whole universe, and everything comes from that God. And while they may be in exile, this creation story is a story that basically tells the exiles that their God is still God, and even though the temple's destroyed, uh, God doesn't need a temple to exist in, because God created everything, and God is in everything, and all these things are good. So you get one of the most iconic passages in the Bible that comes out of this exilic period. And you also get this great passage from Isaiah that the New Testament authors pick up in the Gospels, Isaiah 40:3-5. And 40:3-5 is this section of return. So you get this Genesis passage. The priestly writers write this passage saying that, don't lose faith. God is still in control, even when you are in exile. Isaiah has this great passage of return, that we will be brought back to the land of Israel. So in Isaiah, this Isaiah 40:3-5 says, "A voice of one calling, quote, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Now here, Isaiah envisions the return to Jerusalem from exile as a return that God makes possible. So if you look at a map of the point from Babylon, which is kind of modern Iraq, and think of Baghdad, this is where Babylon, the city of Babylon was, to Jerusalem, and that is nothing but desert and mountains. And here, this utopian vision that Isaiah gives, it says, the valleys will be raised up, the mountains will be made low, rough ground will be made level, rugged places plain. In other words, when God brings the people of Israel out of the land of exile, God will give them an easy path, a beautiful path all the way back home. So here you have this incredible vision of return written during the Babylonian exile. And some of the book of Daniel was written here too. This is Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are stories of how to resist empire. They wouldn't transgress the law. Daniel wouldn't eat the food that other people ate, so they threw him in the lion's den, and he survived. God delivered him from the lion's den. In other words, Daniel resisted empire, Babylonian empire, and God delivered him because of his obedience. The other story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these guys were put in a fiery furnace because they wouldn't forsake the law of their God for pagan ritual. And so there's another story of deliverance. Now, these stories get picked up later on, which should be real fascinating for us. But these are in the narrative of Daniel. You have these anti-empire understanding. So Genesis, Isaiah, and Daniel give three very different understandings of empire, but all of them are words of hope and deliverance and return in the midst of Babylonian empire. All of these things were written during that time. Well, after the Babylonian empire, the Persians destroy Babylon, and there is a return. And it's not quite as beautiful as Isaiah depicted. You get the period of Ezra and Nehemiah, who are trying to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, and it's really rough going. But during the Persian period, when Cyrus defeated Babylon, in there are other sections of Isaiah, Cyrus is called a Messiah, one who is anointed by God and delivered the children of Israel out of exile. And sure enough, some of them go back to Jerusalem. Not all of them do. There remain Judeans in Babylon much later, and their descendants of those are used to still be there until the current political situation of war in Iraq. But the Persian Empire overcame the Babylonian Empire, and here you get the story of Ezra and Nehemiah and this return and how they negotiated rebuilding a wall and a temple with the Persian Empire. Now, they weren't an independent state or anything like that, but they were able to rebuild. And then after the Persian Empire, you have the Hellenistic period, which is in the 300s, right? Alexander the Great comes through the area, destroys the Persian Empire, marches all the way to India, and this whole area becomes Greek. And, Alexander doesn't live that long, but not after he's gone. This huge kingdom is divided up into big sections, and where Judea is, that was right on the border of the Seleucid dynasty and the Ptolemaic dynasty. So when you hear Seleucid, think Syria and north, and when you think of Ptolemy, think of Egypt in North Africa. And those two intersected right at Israel. And so, but they were both Greek, and this is during the Greek period. And that's where you get another section of Daniel being written that's very kind of anti-Greek, and it shows the Greeks as bad leaders. And then this is also the period where you get first, second, third, and fourth Maccabees. All this was written. Now, this is in the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books. But Maccabees starts telling the story about Eleazar, this former priest. It tells a story about a widow with 7 sons. And they do what Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do. But they do it under Greek rule. And they resist these Greek rulers who attempt to put an altar of Zeus in the Holy of Holies in the temple. So they resist this and end up being killed. And so there's no deliverance for these 7 sons and Eleazar in this story of resistance against Greek empire. They're actually killed, but their deaths are noble, right? So they die for the cause, and they inspire others to resist, which leads to the Maccabean revolt and the beginning of the Hasmonean Empire, or the Hasmonean dynasty. So there's this section after the Hellenistic period and before the Roman period where Judea is an independent and autonomous state. It's just very small and it's very short-lived. The Hasmoneans, however, are thoroughly Greek. They write Greek, all their literature's in Greek. Even the books of Maccabees, all these books are written in Greek. The entire Apocrypha was written probably during this time. It's all written in Greek. So, the Persian Empire's language was Aramaic. So they ruled this area for a very long time. So Aramaic became the language of Judea and Palestine during the Persian Empire. But when the Greeks came over and took it, Greek became the primary language of the economy. So within Judea, people spoke Aramaic, but were pretty fluent in Greek as well. And that's when the Hasmonean dynasty existed, and they were thoroughly Greek. So they were certainly Jewish or Judean, but thoroughly Greek by this time. I mean, this is hundreds of years. And then the Roman Empire came and annexed this area. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, but it was 63 before the Common Era when Rome came to power. And they took this area without a fight. They just annexed it. And the leaders at the time said, yes, that's totally fine. So what I want you to do is to see how the Bible this is the divided kingdom period. So after David and the series of generations of when Israel was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, from that time period all the way into the time of the New Testament, outside of this short Hasmonean period of around 100 years or so, this whole area and the Jewish people or Judean people were under empire. Whether it was Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic, or Roman, they were the subjects of empire. So in some profound ways, the Bible is a library of imperialism, but it's written from below. Almost every story is how to resist empire. From Jonah's frustration with God because God would have mercy on the Assyrians, to Daniel in the lion's den, and Isaiah's vision of return, and Genesis' statement that the God of Israel is not lost even though the temple is, and that God is in control from the very beginning, and there is no other God except that God. That's the Babylonian period. You got the rebuilding under the Persian period and this kind of negotiating Persian Empire with the rebuilding of the walls. Then the Hellenistic period where the Greeks are terrible rulers of the Jewish people. They put up false gods in the Holy of Holies, and you get this resistance unto death with the Maccabees. And then comes the Roman period, and that's when all the New Testament literature is written. So when you look at the Bible, the whole Bible, as different as the books are and the different periods they are, this is definitely material that was written under imperialism, written as from below, written by the people the vanquished, the conquered. So how do the vanquished, how do those who are conquered exist under oppression and in that kind of setting? And the Bible offers that. I mean, this is exactly what these books are. Now, the books were written by well-educated people because they had to be. They were literate at the time. But they are absolutely writing under the oppression of imperialism. And none of them say that it was great. I mean, Ezra and Nehemiah, in spite of the fact that they were allowed to go back, they had a really tough time negotiating with the Persian Empire, and that's probably the least resistant literature in the Bible when it comes to empire. So when you get to the New Testament, what do we get in the New Testament? Is the New Testament also a library of imperialism in the sense that it's written from below, resisting empire? So let's look at Rome and Judea in the first century, and I'm doing this to give you. I'm trying to set up a context out of which the letter of James is written. But I want you to see that this is a long history of imperialism, of one empire to the next, and that all the literature of the Bible is written not as victors, not as the winners of the imperial gain. These are the subjects of the empire. And here you got a map of Judea in the first century. You'll see that Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, those three regions make up Judea, the province of Judea. Perea was its own thing. Decapolis was its own thing. Galilee was its own thing. Phoenicia or Syrophoenicia was its own thing. That's actually the Syrian province. Phoenicia is. It'll be called the province of Syria later. But all these regions are right there together. But let's look at this in a little bit more context. And what I'm going to do on our Moodle site, I'll have a kind of a chronology of history during the first couple of centuries before the Common Era and after the Common Era, to give you a more detailed timeline of what was going on during this period. But this is for the sake of this presentation, I'll be a little brief. But it's in 63 that General Pompey of the Roman army landed in Judea and just annexed it. There was no battle. There was no war. He came in and said, "This is Rome now." And the Hasmonean leaders, who were all Greek speakers, but definitely Judean, said yes. Mainly because they wanted Roman protection. The Persians were still strong in the east, and they felt like Rome would be a better political partner. They thought Rome was stronger, and Rome was. But they didn't really know what they were getting into. I mean, to be honest with you, it was the whole Roman period was pretty devastating, as we'll see. But this ended the independent state of Israel under the Hasmonean rule, and so that's how it shook down. Herod the Great, not long after this, within 20 years, is considered the king of Judah by Caesar, Augustus Caesar, because Herod and Augustus knew each other. Herod was educated in Rome, and Herod the Great was despised among local people. But he ruled for a long time, all the way up to for the Common Era. And he deeply hated. Judeans called him the Idumean king because they didn't think he was full-blooded Judean, and Idumea was kind of the ancient enemies of Judea, and so his birth was disputed, and so writings of Josephus are full of stories about how bad King Herod was, how much he was despised. However, he was an incredible builder. Somehow he had all this money. He rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. He built palaces in the desert. He built a palace inside of a mountain. The architectural work that is accredited to him is pretty incredible. So Herod the Great rules. He is in full control of Judea, but he's a client king. He does whatever Rome tells him to. He doesn't exercise any kind of authority against Rome. He just does exactly what he's told. But when he dies, this area is divided into tetrarchies between his three sons, and they are pretty abysmal. But they kind of hold it together until 40. So it's during this time period that the sons were allowed to be kind of the governors. So you had Judean governance, but Rome sent in Roman leaders as well. And the Roman leaders, they were the ones that were taking care of the economy. So while the governors and the government existed as a Judean government, there were Roman economic leaders who made sure taxes were taken up for Rome, and they really handled the money. This is the Roman prefects, the prefectoriate. So this is the most common one, and the most famous one was Pontius Pilate. This is a really tough period. This is when Jesus would have been born and died during this period. It was in turmoil because of this Judean-Roman leadership between the economy and government. It just didn't work out real well, and it was kind of prone to failure. But in 41, Herod Antipas, he's like the grandson of Herod the Great. is considered the ruler, the king of Israel again, because he was the friend of Claudius, who was the emperor at the time. The problem is Herod Antipas died in 44, so you had the Roman prefects and the Judean governors up until 41, and then you had a consolidation with Antipas from 41 to 44, and then when he died, Rome took direct rule from 44 to 66. And these were the procurators. So you'll see these prefects and procurators mentioned in the New Testament, and this is what's different about them. The prefects were economic leaders. The procurators were the ones who were in total control. They governed both the government and the economy. And this was oppressive. 44 to 46 was a very oppressive time. Judeans did not feel like they had leaders that represented them. Even the high priests during this time were chosen directly by Roman leaders and went against Judean culture and custom. And so this was a very, very contentious time that ultimately led to the Jewish revolt or the Jewish wars from 66 to 70. While it was a revolt, Rome utterly squashed it. The major general of the Roman legions at the time was Vespasian, and so he was sent to come and squash the revolt, and he did. But before he was finished, he went back to Rome and became the emperor and left his son Titus to finish the business, and Titus did. After the revolt was totally squashed and Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, it was after this period that the Romans set up the legates, the legates. This is total Roman governance from the government to economy, and they ruled with absolute authority. And after the revolt, it was pretty decimated. So this is the nature of Judea in the first century. And so Jesus' entire life and ministry in the Galilee and Judea and Samaria and even Syrophoenicia happened under Roman rule. And all the disciples lived and breathed during this time. This is where they would have followed Jesus around. This is during this political situation that the Jesus movement began. So the Jesus movement, happened under Roman imperialism. It happened during Roman imperialism. And it was deeply affected by this and had direct, some of the writings in the New Testament directly confront imperialism, Roman imperialism in particular. But let's talk from the region down to Jerusalem. This picture here is, I was in Jerusalem in January, and this is a picture right at the temple. So the wall there is part of the temple that was still standing after Rome destroyed it. And these huge boulders, and you can see how big they are as in relation to the people standing beside them. These were part of the temple that Herod built. And this is the rubble that has been there since Rome destroyed it. I mean, imagine how violent this conflict was and the mechanisms of war that Rome used to knock the temple down. And again, it wasn't completely destroyed because you can see the edge of the temple there. This was not the main temple itself. It was just basically kind of the foundation of it. And way up on top is where the temple would have been. But Rome utterly destroyed it and destroyed Jerusalem as the end result. So the government and the temple, there was, whether it was Roman or Judean government rule, the temple continued to function. And the temple was the center of religious life for Judeans. It's where they came and brought their sacrifices for the priesthood to sacrifice. It's where they would have major religious services. Even Jesus, when he was circumcised, was brought here. His parents came with him when he's a teenager and had services here. So the temple was a major component to Judean life in Jerusalem. And the government had worked directly with the temple. So Herod, he would appoint the high priesthood, the leaders of the temple, the Sanhedrin. These were people who would work directly with the government. And so there was always this tension between the temple as a state religion being totally intertwined with the government. And when the government is totally intertwined with Rome, that creates a lot of tension. And so what Rome did, Rome raised huge towers just beside the temple that actually was higher than the temple mount itself, so that the Roman governors and the soldiers could look down onto the Temple Mount and make sure that nobody was kind of constructing any kind of rally or protest or anything like that. So the Roman towers were taller than the temple itself and stood directly beside it. And it was basically a guard tower for Roman legions to make sure there was nothing happening on the Temple Mount that would cause an insurrection. And the Sanhedrin, these were the leaders of the temple, mostly made up of Sadducees and priests and high priests. It was the whole governing structure. And they tended to be very educated and very wealthy and very distrusted among the regular people. And these are the folks who are running the temple. The high priests themselves, these were the highest religious leaders that directed the temple. And it was always contentious because the Herod the Great or the Judean governors would appoint these guys because they were so important. But that's not exactly how the Torah and the Bible said how the high priest was supposed to be chosen. So there was a lot of contentiousness during this period about how the highest level religious leader of the time was chosen, and it created a lot of civil unrest within Jerusalem proper, but also within the larger region. There were temple taxes that Jews had to pay, and not just within Judea, but across the Roman Empire. And Judeans/Jews were given special dispensation by the Roman government to send this money back to the temple for its maintenance and its authority. Now, when they let that happen, the Romans let that happen, but the whole point was the temple was supposed to keep the order. So the politics are deeply ingrained within this temple tax. The high priest had to work with the governors to make sure that the people didn't revolt. So the messages, the way things were constructed here, this was to maintain status quo. And so temple taxes were allowed to be taken. But that was not in lieu of Roman taxes. And so the Romans taxed the people too, and they taxed the government, and the government was in charge of making sure these taxes were delivered to Rome. So tax collectors were pretty hated, and they looked like Roman puppets and sympathizers, and they would extract money from people and send it to Rome. And they could determine how much those taxes were. So it was pretty, again, all this, you can see how tense this time period was. And so there was what happens between the temple and the temple cult and all the governing bodies around the temple and the people. there was a lot of distrust. Most people continue to, from a religious standpoint, bring sacrifices and pay their temple taxes. But people like the Essenes really didn't appreciate that, and they withdrew. They stopped paying temple taxes, and they withdrew from the temple and sacrificed on their own and built their own altars because they thought that the temple was totally corrupt. And this was some of the reasons why the people revolted eventually, is because they felt like the temple was nothing more than the puppet of Rome, and that the government was nothing but a puppet government of Rome, which ends in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So it ends pretty bad, as you can see with these boulders there. Again, these boulders have been there for over 2,000 years since Rome destroyed it in 70. So now let's talk about James, Rome and James in particular. So we know that there's Roman leadership, there's Judean leadership, and then there's sectarian leadership with these folks who are taken off into the wilderness, the Essenes, the Qumran community, the folks who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Jesus movement, I don't think it was necessarily a part of the Essene group, but we do know that Jesus was baptized by John in the Judean wilderness, which was right there where the Qumran community exists. So if you drive down to the Dead Sea or the bottom of the Jordan River where John most likely baptized, you're going to drive through the Qumran region where they found the Qumran scrolls and the Qumran community where people were, living these sectarian lifestyles away from Jerusalem. So there's definitely a connection there. And James is a part of that. He's the leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus dies. So in the Rise of Josephus talks about 3 different schools of Judeans: the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. The Sadducees are the ones connected to the temple and helping run the temple. Pharisees are considered like teachers of the law. These are people who are very literate and understand the Torah. So if the Sadducees are connected to the temple, the Pharisees are connected to the Torah. And the Essenes are the ones who leave it all and go out into the wilderness and study for themselves and create a community that they felt was the pure and righteous Judeans. The other group, the Zealots, Josephus doesn't call these guys a sect or a school of Judeanists, but he talks about them a lot. And it's basically everybody who revolts against Rome. And zealot is exactly what it sounds. People who have a lot of zeal or jealousy, and these are the ones who take up arms against the Roman government. So Josephus talks about at least 4 groups of people. And where would James and the Jesus movement fit within this type of Judeanness? And where would they fit within the Roman Empire? Clearly James is some kind of sectarian nature, because he talks about in the theme passage, James chapter 1, verse 27, it says, "Pure and undefiled religion is this, to care for the widow and orphan in their distress, and to remain unstained by the world." So this pure and undefiled, and this be unstained, this is definitely language that sounds like Essenes, this purity. And the purity is in relation to the world. In chapter 4, 1 through 12, James talks about friendship with the world and friendship with God can't exist at the same time. If you are a friend of the world, then you are an enemy of God, and vice versa. So the world here, what world is James talking about beyond the Roman world? It is the Roman world. It is the Roman Empire that is the antithesis to the God that James serves. So it's definitely anti-Roman Empire, the letter of James is. And I think the Jesus movement would largely be anti-imperial, anti-Roman. but it's a certain kind of Judeanness. James is negotiating identity in relation to the Roman Empire, but also within that Judeanness, within the Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. Who is James in the midst of that? And the Jesus movement. And I think the Jesus movement is certainly this kind of sectarian nature that resists the status quo within Judeanness, resists the Sadducees, resists the Pharisees. And so it becomes very close to the Essene Qumran movement. But does it come close to the Zealots? Does the Jesus movement take up arms against Rome? It's a big question. We know that one of the disciples is called Simon the Zealot, right? But we also have a tax collector, which is deeply Roman. So the disciples of Jesus, according to the New Testament, are very diverse. They're from the Roman collaborators to Roman revolutionaries and everything on the in-between. And so James is right in the middle of that. And as we get into the book itself, I want you to pay close attention to how James constructs identity in relation to Roman imperialism and other forms of Jewishness / Judeanness. If you have any questions, please give me an email and let me know. I hope you found this interesting, and you got a couple more lectures to go before the end of the week. So do all the readings. Make sure you're keeping up with the readings, and follow along with the lectures because the quizzes will be based on these things. Have a good one.